Hi, I just want to take a couple minutes and go over a couple questions that I had coming in about setting of depth gauges. And I just wanted to kind of cover some things. There's two or three different types. And for most purposes, people think about taking and just using a flat file. If you notice here on the depth gauge, or raker, some people call it, or drag, the radius around the front end here. And so more or less you want to try to keep that as box stock as possible. You want to try to keep that same radius. But as you take down the depth gauges, you're going to end up, if you're using a flat file, it starts to get a little bit flat. There is on some of the newer chains a little bit of a witness mark there that kind of shows you. But as you take that down, you have to re-radius that front edge there. And so that's one way. This type of a guide more or less takes an average of several teeth. The flat file, this is a 25 thousandths gauge it from Oregon, and you would file off whatever sticks up through there. And so that's the purpose of that particular type of a guide, okay? And then another type that you have is the Husqvarna file plate, and that takes and it cuts each tooth independently. And that goes back to a theory of Carlton saw chain, the Carlton file plate. And more or less, if you set the height of the depth gauge in relationship to the height of the point, which the height of the point is more or less regulated by the length of the tooth. As you file or grind back, that particular tooth point gets shorter. So here you take this type of plate. It has a hardwood and a softwood setting. I generally always use the hardwood. And it more or less goes from the chassis of the chain up past the point, and then the flat file would then take that off. It is more at a little bit of a slight angle down, which follows the depth gauge radius a little bit better than some other just flat across. But that is really, to me, one of the best ways to set the depth gauge. Now, another way is utilizing the Ferd Chain Sharp or the Husqvarna Sharp Force, or even the Steel 2-in-1 tool, or the Ferd CSX tool basically does the same here. And more or less that sets up, and it takes and this takes and sets on the tooth that you're sharpening, and then indexes off of the tooth in front. And as you file through, because the two tops of the teeth are slanted back, then more or less as you shorten the tooth, the whole guide comes down, and the flat file comes in touch with the raker. And so that sets it much the same way as the Husqvarna plate does in shortening the depth gauge in relationship to the height of the point. Either way, when you take and you use especially this one, is that it's going to take and cut that depth gauge flat. And so at that point, that means that you would take and re-radius. It just takes very little stroke, and you don't want to take it flat because that's going to lower your gauge setting again. But you want to take and just radius that upper edge. So not flat, because that will drop your depth gauges below the setting you're desiring. And as you radius back over, it just basically takes that little flat spot off. So that's what you're trying to accomplish. Several tools doing the same thing. Depth gauge settings are really important to keep that chain pulling into the fiber without a lot of pressure, but it's also important you don't take them too low, because that can cause the tooth to bite in, especially in the tip. Reactive forces can be greater. So depth gauge settings are critical to proper cut, but also your safety. This is one of Tim's tips, and we hope to see you along the Forest Apps Road. Good sawing to you.